This will be a day long remembered. Now I am the master.
Welcome to another episode of Legends and Theories, and welcome to my ranking of the Indiana Jones villains. And I'm only going to be doing the personal ranking of them. I don't think it is really necessary to rank them by power like I did for the artifacts. I think that, with the exception of Mola Ram, they're all on around the same power level and all around the same level of competence. And that's honestly, I think, something that you could argue if you want to take a look at their military position, but I wouldn't be looking at that. I'd be looking at them as an individual, and that's really it. And with this one, I'm looking at generally the main or major villains, but we'll have a quick look as honorable mentions to villains that were more for the opening scenes of the movies, at least for the first three, since 4 and 5 don't really have different villains for the opening scenes. So let's go straight into it. In our honorable mentions, at number 3 is Fedora or Garth and Panama Hat. And these are the two people that were involved with the cross in The Last Crusade. And honestly, I think just the fact that we don't have a full name for either of them, and they are pretty minor. They are not super big in the chase against young Indy or in the fight at the end, and really the only iconic parts are Fedora gives Indy his hat, and the fact that the other guy just says that so do you. I think that those are really the two most best parts of them, but there's not really much to them, and I think that they just kind of deserve to be here because they aren't too major and not too memorable. At number 2 of these honorable mentions is Satipo, and I think that he is a lot more memorable than the previous two and does have some nice moments and has a pretty memorable death. And honestly, yeah, I think that he just deserves to be higher than them, but I don't think he is as memorable as others. And he does have some nice moments, but he doesn't have a really great moment like number 1 for the honorable mentions does. For number 1, we have Lao Che, and yeah, he is definitely, at least in my opinion, the most iconic of them, and at least the ones that are in a more minor role. He is the only villain on this list that actually winds up winning and getting away with everything he does. And the only thing he really fails in is his attempted assassination of Indiana Jones. And that was more to luck that Indy had than his plan. And I think that him just getting that little victory and being able to get away with basically everything and having a really cool involvement in the opening scene of Temple of Doom definitely gives him the spot on here. Starting off at number 7 of the actual list, we have Marina Spalko, and I think that she's fine, and she's definitely the weakest of them. She's one of the better parts of Crystal Skull, if you could say it has better parts. But I think that really there is not really any problems with her. It's just she's not a super interesting character and is part of the worst Indiana Jones movie. But really, besides that, nothing really to say against her. She just is in a bad movie and doesn't really have much to do. Up next is Jurgen Voller. Probably pronounced the first name wrong, but he's the villain of Dial of Destiny, and honestly, he's a pretty good villain, and I just think that he's not as memorable as the other ones, and definitely has a far less memorable death, and honestly, really, besides that, there's nothing wrong with him. He's just not as iconic as the other villains. At number 5 is Walter Donovan, and he is one of the biggest threats in The Last Crusade. And honestly, I think that although he is pretty iconic for his death, I think that really besides his death, there's nothing much more to put him over anyone else. I think that really well, actually, yes, it's most of the villains, but their deaths just pushed him up a little bit more. And he does provide an interesting threat, but is personally not one of my favorites. At number 4 is Arnold Tote, and just like Donovan, I think that he's a fine villain and really doesn't have too many great scenes. And I'll be discussing something about the villains in at the end of the video, but again, his death just puts him above everyone else because of his face melting, and it's definitely the most memorable of the deaths, and I think that just pushes him up. But with him not really having as much to do and being a little more background, I still have to put him here. But he's a big enough threat to at least make it onto this list and take it out of the honorable mentions. At number 3 is René Belloq, and Belloq is a pretty good villain in Raiders, but again, I just think that he is not as great as the other ones. He is kind of has a really generic face, and it took me a while to realize that he is the person in the priest outfit at the end of Raiders. I don't know, I always thought that it was just someone else, and Belloq managed to get away, or was one of the people that died in the mass death scene, but once I finally realized it was him, I was just like, oh, I just feel like he has, I don't know, just such a generic face, and the outfit was so different to what he wore. Typically, I just thought he was a different person. And yeah, honestly, it's kind of that to me that doesn't put him higher, but still, he is an interesting character, saying he is kind of like a dark reflection of Indiana Jones. No real problems with him, just I think that he definitely could have been a little better. At number 2 is Elsa Schneider, and of all of them, I think she's definitely my favorite. She has the most interesting part of being an ally that turns out to be an enemy, and her death, although not as iconic as the other ones in terms of visuals, was probably the more interesting executed, where it was fully her decision to basically die, and she could have saved herself. She also has probably the most moral complexities of all of the villains, and doesn't fully agree with what's going on, but is just trying to do what she thinks is the best option, even though it isn't. And yeah, honestly, I think she's definitely the most interesting of everyone so far, but I think there's a really big gap between number 2 and number 1. At number 1 is Mola Ram, and I don't think he's the best of them because he's just the most involved of all the villains and definitely poses the greatest threat. He's the one with any real power, and him ripping out hearts is pretty iconic. Only weakness with him is his death is just kind of generic, with him being eaten by alligators or crocodiles, I don't remember which one, after falling a great height, and is the only one to be directly killed by India, with everyone else just kind of dying to their poor decision making or the artifact killing them. And honestly, yeah, I think that he's really the only great Indiana Jones villain, and definitely has some of the coolest scenes. And the biggest problem with Indiana Jones villains is I think they're all decently good, with the exception of Mola Ram, but the thing is, the artifacts are typically what draws you in, and even though Mola Ram is the best of the villains, he's the weakest of the trilogy since he's in Temple of Doom, which focuses more on him as a villain, which, in the, at least the first three films, make it feel a little less Indiana Jones. And even though he is the best of the villains, that does give Temple of Doom a weakness because it's not focusing on the artifacts and the mystery behind them as much as him. And he sort of serves as the mystical thing in his movie, which just puts him above everyone else. Also, him being kind of terrifying and being the reason that PG-13 was actually created is pretty interesting. But yeah, as I said, I think that Indiana Jones really isn't known for its villains. It's for the artifacts and the adventures and his allies, which I will be looking at next week. And the reason I decided to do this first is because, as I said, the villains are really not super memorable and are really only known for their kind of gruesome deaths. But yeah, honestly, I just think that as people, they aren't really super interesting, with the exception of Mola Ram, who is just interesting because he is basically pure evil and is more of a traditional villain. But I want to know what you think. How would you rank them? And do you agree with my thought on the villains? Please let me know in the comments. And I'll see you on the next episode of Legends and Theories. Thank you for watching this episode of Legends and Theories. Please subscribe, like the video, share the video, leave a comment, check out the video on screen, and may the Force be with you.